start. We have a very tight schedule, so we will be very efficient with the time this morning. I'm Maria Engelmark. I'm Director of International Affairs here at Linköping University, and I'm very happy to welcome His Excellency Ambassador of the UK, Mr. David Cairns, who will make a speech to us about Brexit, amongst others. He will talk about other issues. There are other issues, believe it or not, to talk about concerning the UK. I will not be talking very long. I will very soon leave the floor to Senior Lecturer Per Jansson, who will be guiding us through this seminar. That will consist of the talk of the ambassador and also a talk by our Professor Emeritus Professor Charles Woolfson, who is has a very good insight in Brexit and has been studied this for long. So I'm sure we'll be very enlightened after this talk, and not least after all your questions that you will be able to ask the ambassador and Professor Charles Woolfson. So very welcome to you all, and I now leave the floor to Per Jansson.
Thank you. When thinking about something suitably provocative to say in order to introduce this seminar on Brexit, I came across a quote in Winston Churchill's Second War Memoirs, the first volume, The Gathering Storm, where he says at one point, "For 400 years, the foreign policy of England has been to oppose the strongest, most dominating power on the continent. Here is the wonderful, unconscious tradition of British foreign policy." All our thoughts rest in that tradition today, that is, then. I don't mean to suggest that the conditions are exactly alike, but there is this idea, I think, that Brexit may be has something to do with the deep traditions of British foreign policy. That, I think, is also, that observation is really an indication that we need to understand Brexit, not just prepare, we need to understand what Brexit really is about. And I think an excellent way of preparing ourselves and better understanding Brexit is to listen to David Cairns, the UK's ambassador to Stockholm since 2015, I believe, who will talk to us about Brexit and effects on Sweden. After that, there will be time for a few questions. The schedule is tight. Before I introduce our next speaker, Professor Woolfson. But now, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Per. That wasn't that provocative. I thought you were going to be much tougher. So it's a very great pleasure to be here at Linköping University. Thank you all for coming out this morning. I think I can see in the room that we have a mixture of students and staff. And if I understand correctly from Maria, a lot of the students are interested in political science. So I thought I would do a little bit of sort of the academic end, as it were, around Brexit and what it sort of means, and then a little bit of practical Brexit, so for what it means for you, perhaps personally. As Maria said, I'm ambassador here, and of course Brexit takes a lot of our work, but it's not everything we do. So I've been here in Linköping meeting companies like Saab, who have a big business in the UK, and Saab's business is defence. And on the defence field, we have done an awful lot with Sweden in the last few years because of Russia and threats happening in this region and what's happening in Ukraine. And generally, I find at universities, people have quite broad interest in foreign policy and international relations. So if you are interested in something other than Brexit, please feel free to ask. I will do my best to answer any questions on anything. Brexit. So, as I said, I'll start with kind of a little bit of maybe looking back on why it happened and what it means. I mean, it is, by UK standards, pretty much as close as we get to a revolution. We are ripping up and changing 45 years of membership of the EU. And if you are watching the UK press, or if you're from the UK and you've been in the UK, you know how emotionally wrenching the last 2.5 to 3 years have been, how angry the country is in so many different directions about the way this is all happening, and how the country has actually become pretty more split since the actual referendum in 2016. What caused it all? So many books have already been written. Many more books will be written about this, and there are now films. So if you haven't seen the Channel 4 Benedict Cumberbatch film, Brexit and Uncivil War, I can recommend it to you because it is absolutely fascinating, I would say. My view is I think you have to go back to the great crash of 2007. Where the UK, after a period of 16 years of uninterrupted growth, had its worst economic crash since the 30s. And it wasn't just the UK, it was also the United States, it was also a number of countries across the European continent who were affected by this crash. But we are now 10 years on, and in terms of living standards and wages, the UK is not yet back where it was. And that's a generation of people coming into the workforce. You've had a period where actually what didn't happen was the unemployment rate did not really go up very much. So in previous difficult times in the UK, unemployment has gone very high. But that didn't happen, and that was a relief to many economists and political commentators. We're still retaining good employment. But if you look at the employment, the growth in the number of very low-paid jobs, 0 hours contracts, number of people essentially on the minimum working wage, and the effect that had on society of people just feeling quite a lot poorer, and they didn't feel it was really their fault. And therefore, when it comes to elections or the referendum, a lot of lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in politicians, lack of trust in all those businesses were saying, no, Brexit will be bad for you. Well, why should we trust you? You broke our economic system. That whole lack of trust, rise in populism, I think, was a big factor behind the Brexit vote. In the same way that after that, the great economic crash in the 30s, that led to the rise of a terrible 30s and 40s in Europe and the world after what had been the worst economic crash we have seen. I think that's how big 2007 was in my country, in the United States and elsewhere. I think that's a big thing behind it. The other thing behind it on the other side was, I would say, changing society. And what I mean by that is the perhaps unintended effect or unanticipated effect or poorly anticipated effect of what enlargement of the European Union meant to Britain. So Britain had been a country that championed the enlargement of the EU to the Eastern European countries, and we were pretty proud of doing so. Tony Blair, then Prime Minister, was one of the most outspoken, saying we should open up Europe, we should welcome these people in, and in Britain we should welcome them into our country. And we were proud to be able to say so. But that approach was based on something that was proved wrong, which was assumptions on how many people would come to Britain. And I think the expected numbers were tens of thousands. The actual numbers of people just from Poland that came from 2004 to 2014-16 was around 1 million. And that's fantastic because they come and they work and they've contributed to the economy. But what had happened in a lot of smaller, poorer parts of the country was a sense of a changing society, where the schools felt full. People couldn't get appointments at the doctor. And you had, I think in the richer more long-term international cities like London or Manchester or my hometown Cambridge, the academic ones, there was no big deal about it. They were already pretty multicultural places. But outside those cities, 50 miles from my hometown Cambridge, sounds like Kings Lynn and Wisbech, which had really struggled after the crash, and at the same time had felt this changing societies. It was another thing that they just said, this is not right. We don't like how our country is developing, and then given a chance to seemingly vote against it by voting to leave the EU, they took it. And if I go back to the Benedict Cumberbatch film, one part in that where they visit this really poor part of one of the MP's constituencies, and there's people who said they have no jobs, they've seen no politicians for 20 years. Life is really tough. What have we got to lose? And all you elites saying, do the right thing, stay in, well, get lost. We're going to do something else. And I think that will cause it. As I say, lots of books will be written about this. I'm not going to be writing one, but the analysis of what happened in Britain, actually what happened in the United States in the aftermath of the crash of 2006, 2007, 2008 is something that future generations of students are going to be studying for many years. And Brexit is one of those. So it happened, the vote happened, and since then, as you've all been following, we have been trying to put into effect the vote of the people of Britain. And you do not need me to tell you that has been quite a bumpy journey. Mrs. May, when she took over as Prime Minister in the autumn of 2016, promised that she would implement it. And she began that process in spring of 2017 by formally beginning the 2-year process to leave. And that 2-year process comes to an end at the end of next month. And a lot of the debate has been internal in the UK about what do we actually want. And as you've seen, it's not quite clear what the UK wants on this. And then, of course, a lot of it has also been negotiations with the EU to set out how it's going to be. And those negotiations are essentially in 2 parts. There is a leaving part, and there is what is the future, how is the future going to work part. And the negotiations hitherto have really been about the leaving. You have now essentially a legal agreement, a withdrawal treaty of some nearly 600 pages, which sets out the terms on which we leave. And then you have a political declaration, which gives us sort of a framework for how the future is going to be. And if all goes to plan, and I'll come back to that in a minute, if all goes to plan, we will leave on March, at the end of March. We will then enter a 2-year period interim where we prepare the detail for how it's going to work once at the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. I say that's a plan. What you are reading is, well, what happens if there's no deal and it crashes out? You probably ask, will the UK change its mind and vote again? And all of those options are possible. But the most likely option, the most likely thing to happen is actually we do leave with a deal in March, and we do move into this period, and we do then prepare for the next stage. As I said, other things are possible, but I think just the way things develop generally, you end up doing what you said you are going to do. That said, as I said, it has been a very up and down process. And I think for those of you who are here because of a personal interest or a personal link to the UK or are Brits here in Sweden, it has been quite an emotional roller coaster the last couple of years about what does it mean for me? Would I be able to stay in Sweden? Can I carry on working here? If I want to go and study in the UK, will I be able to do so? And it's lurched from a political agreement, essentially at the end of 2017, and everybody relaxed, to a technical agreement at the end of 2018, and people thought, okay, we're done, to a rejection of that by the British Parliament, to therefore things all up in the air again, and what is going to happen? And the clock is ticking, and that's quite stressful, I think, for everybody involved. So on that note, let me just cover a couple of practical points for those of you interested in the practical elements of this. So firstly, for the Brits who are in Sweden, they're about 30,000. For the Swedes in the UK, they're about 100,000. Assuming there is a deal, what will happen is that all people's rights, all the rights will be protected until the end of 2021, and people will be able to carry on as they are and stay. And then we will move to a new system for people moving after that point. And the Swedish government and the UK government have put out material about how that system should be working in due course. More worrying, perhaps for you, is, okay, what happens if we crash out without a deal at the end of March? So that is probably less clear. I would say the UK government has been more generous so far than other EU countries, saying actually you'll still be welcome. So there are 3.5 million EU citizens in the UK, and we have essentially said you will be welcome to stay, and the rights aren't exactly the same, but they're by and large the same. The Swedish government announced around Christmas time sort of an initial announcement, which is to say that if we end up leaving without a deal, then for the first year, British people in Sweden will have exactly the same rights as other EU citizens. I think that's an initial thing, and we'll see what comes after that. So that's one, citizens. Then in the academic world and for students, there are always lots of questions about research and research funding and students going to study. So for Swedish students which want to go and study in the UK, what we have said is for all those students that either started last year or will start this September, you are starting on with European funding for that. If that funding stops, then the UK government will cover it. So any students starting last year or this year do not need to worry about that funding. That will be covered. We've not yet announced what happens for students starting in the autumn of 2020, but we will do so before the application season for that arrives. So that gives some reassurance. For those involved in research, again, there is some reassurance, but I think there's some more negative stories around this. So again, what we have said is, for the time being, UK projects or joint UK-EU projects will get European funding, and so that's fine. If that was to stop, the UK would make up the difference. I think what we are hearing anecdotally is that some European-based projects are saying, actually, we can't do something with the Brits. We will stop, and we'll do it without you, which is, it's not actually necessary, but I understand why it's happening. The most important thing, though, on research funding is around the future, and that is not yet decided. So what I say to universities that I meet, and what British universities say when they come here, and they are coming here more, is that whatever happens in the future relationships with the EU, research and academic cooperation is something that everyone really, really wants to carry on with. So at the moment, the UK contributes about £1 billion a year into European research projects, and we have said pretty clearly that our intention is to continue with that level of contribution so that we can be part of those programs. And I think if you are the Swedish government, which is worried about the cost of Brexit to Sweden, the fact that UK is happy to carry on contributing that amount of money is pretty welcome. And I don't anticipate this is going to be a really contentious part of the negotiations in the future, but it's not settled yet. So what I would encourage you in the faculties to do is to encourage this university and other Swedish universities to say, yes, please, let's carry on working with the Brits and let's let them pay their way into the system so they can do it. And that hopefully will work out during those future negotiations. Last point, perhaps, because then it's time for questions, is to say, again, the journey on Brexit so far has been quite up and down, and I don't think most people at the beginning thought it would last this long. But the the reality is it's not nearly over. Because even when we are leaving in March, we are leaving to a transitional period during which time we have to prepare what the future is going to look like. And although the political agreement is actually quite ambitious and quite positive of how that is going to be, turning that actually into concrete agreement is going to take quite a lot of time, quite a lot of energy, and will be quite difficult on some things like fish, which is not necessarily a Sweden political interest, but is definitely a French, Spanish, Dutch, Danish political interest. So issues like that are going to be really hard. What I would say again to you, and what we try to say to Sweden is one of those countries that is perhaps most sad that we are leaving. It is one of the countries that is most close to the UK in EU matters and in trade and in people. Sweden's diaspora in the UK is the second biggest outside Sweden and the United States. UK is number 3. So Sweden is definitely one of those countries that wants to keep the close relationship going as it can. So So my message is keep on arguing for that, because it's not over till it's over, and it's not decided till it's decided. So please keep being patient with the process and engaged in it, and the more chance we all have of making sure that it actually works as well as it can. And that is something we will absolutely do from the UK side as well. So although we have voted to leave the European Union, although our relationship with the European Union will be different, that doesn't mean that we don't want to cooperate. That doesn't mean that we don't want to do trade, do research, do defence, do security cooperation, and so on. We do, we just won't be doing it through Brussels so much anymore. But we definitely want to support Europeans' development and European success, and to be able to work as close as we can together. Last point, picking up your quote, Per. Sometimes when you read the UK media and UK commentators on this, it can get it's quite ugly. You talked about the war. We had an event yesterday evening at Linköping Town Hall, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "But we saved all these Europeans in the war. Why can't they be nicer?" And I said, I don't think that's relevant for this debate. How far do you want to go back? Do you want to go back to 1066, or the Vikings, or the Romans? This is not about the war. And yet, in so much of the UK talking about this, it can feel like it's about a war. And I don't think it's helpful at all. What this is a political decision to leave the construct of the EU, but it's also about how we are going to work together in the future. And the best way to do that is to make sure that these negotiations now and in the coming years go as best as they can. So I'll stop there, if that's right, and then I hope that's fine by an introduction. As I say, I'm happy to answer any questions on Brexit or Brexit, whatever you like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. So we have some time for questions. There is a microphone. That is the microphone. Okay. So maybe if I can hand it over to you. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands, and you will be able to talk to the microphone. And while thinking about that, maybe I can start out with I suppose it's an impossible question, but going back to what you said at the beginning of your talk about the internal splits and the cleavages in British society as a result of the financial crisis and all that, which can be viewed as a sort of a cause for the whole Brexit. So if we look at social development, social cleavages, these things in British society after Brexit, whatever form Brexit takes, I mean, won't that kind of political, social, economic situation be basically the same, or is there hopes that there will be developments in that regard once out of the EU?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and And an answer will be political, because of course there are many of those who supported Brexit very passionately that think this is going to be fantastic for Britain and we will flourish outside the European Union. There are many others who think that this is going to do nothing but harm, and it's just going to make all those problems worse. So, and the answer is nobody knows, but there's very strongly held views about the whole thing. The other point is that actually, as a reaction to the financial difficulties in the UK, Mrs. May, as Prime Minister, when she came in, she made various promises about a more prosperous society for everybody. Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, is very strong about having an economy that works for everybody. And I think those are also generally held by these politicians. They would like to work on that. But the fact is that the politics is dominated by managing the Brexit process. And there's not that much time or energy to do things outside of that. And that, of course, makes it worse for people out in society who say, well, we voted for Brexit back in 2016. Why can't you get on with it? Why can't you get on fixing our roads and improving our schools? So it makes the society more angry. And I think it has become more angry in the past couple of years. Interestingly, here in Sweden, looking at your politics, where actually you have had a sustained period of prosperity where you weren't so affected by the economic crash in 2007, where your differential between the best paid and the lowest paid is much narrower than ours, you still have plenty of angry politics in this country, as you saw in the last election. So it's not just a British thing. This is a sort of a world, I say a developed world wide phenomenon about how are you managing an inclusive society. Also, sort of geographically, so between the bits of this country that are doing well, mostly the cities, and those that are struggling or from the country. Okay. There.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm a UK citizen, and I come to Linköping regularly to work here. I think I agree with much of your analysis, but I think the fundamental problem with the referendum originally was that it was a fundamentally flawed question that people were asked. What we had was a juxtaposition between the status quo, remaining in the EU, and a generalised invitation to vote negatively against the status quo. And that's what people did. A lot of people voted generally because they were dissatisfied with their lot in life and they wanted change and so on and so forth. Had very little to do with the EU per se. And people weren't presented with a concrete option of what actually leaving the EU meant in terms of future relations with the EU. No. It's quite interesting that now, when the concrete options are being put to people and when they're being made aware of them, they're all very unpopular. The Mrs May's proposal that she's trying to blackmail us all into accepting is apparently supported by less than a third of the population. The no-deal option is supported by less than a third of the population. So when people actually have a concrete option to choose from, they don't like it, which is why another referendum is clearly needed. But you can see where I'm coming from, right? I think the other question I would really want to put to you is, because I come here regularly, I talk to a lot of Swedish people, talk to me all the time about this, even though I come here to try and escape it. And Swedish people are generally very polite, so they kind of smile at you, and there's a slight kind of, their foreheads kind of twitch a little, and they kind of, but the overall impression is, why would you do this to yourself? Why would you do this to yourself? You know, it's such an obvious act of self-harm. I mean, virtually every, it's not just a case of the Brexit people saying it's all going to be great, and the non-Brexit people saying it's not going to be great. Virtually every serious economic forecast, every business organisation, every trade union organisation is predicting obvious economic damage from this act of self-harm that's going on right now. So I suppose, I'm just getting this off my chest really, but I suppose the serious question I'm asking you is, don't you think this is doing the reputation of our country some terrible harm right now? Do you think the reputation of our country can recover in the short term from what is going on right now, even when we're dealing with polite people like the Swedes.
Okay. Okay, I think many people sympathise with what you wanted to get off your chest. One thing I should have also mentioned in terms of kind of the causes of Brexit, which I didn't, but it is around of course, the UK's relationship with the European Union as an institution, and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson did not vote for Brexit because they are in a poor part of the world and struggling. They voted because of power, and they voted to take power back from Brussels as they saw it and take back sovereignty. So there's that dynamic as well, which is a relationship between sharing sovereignty or having your own, and that was an important dynamic as well in the political classes about why this was the right thing to do, and we will see how that pans out, because in a global world of both international trade and global cooperation, how much pure self-sovereignty actually really exists in the world, and that is a journey we're going to have to go through. You said the Swedes will smile politely and say, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" I think they also smile politely and say, "Why are you doing it this way? Why can't you have a cross-party consensus on this and have a nice talking it through before you take your decisions? How could you do it in the worst way possible?" They would say politely. However, we have the system that we have, and the UK parliamentary system is, some call it an elective dictatorship, which means if you win a majority in the House of Commons, you can vote things through. Mrs May does not have that because she doesn't have a majority, but she's still following the traditional way, which is a majority through her side of winning votes in Parliament to get it through. I think, in reality, as the country is split and so is Parliament, so that is proving very, very tough, and she'll have to work it through. You mentioned another referendum, and as I said, lots of people ask whether that's going to happen. I don't know. This is a straight answer. It is possible, but it doesn't feel very likely, because what I see most MPs in our Parliament saying is, whatever they think, their constituents voted for leave. They feel they have an obligation to see it through, and by opening up another referendum, that would deny that. So it's possible, but I don't think it's very likely. And then in terms of UK's overall reputation, so two parts to this. So of course, everybody is fascinated, appalled, curious about what is happening with the UK in Brexit. But as I said at the beginning, the UK is not just about Brexit. And actually most people's lives is probably not very Brexit at all. And what we try and do is, as an embassy here, is of course to do our duty on make sure Brexit goes as smoothly as possible, but also to carry on with the day job in a way. So that means working with Swedish companies in Linköping that have an interest in the UK so they can develop their future business. That means working with the Swedish defence forces on defence and security in this region, also domestically on terrorism and so on. So all of that carries on. I think what we try also and say is that people are assuming because of Brexit that we are withdrawing, becoming very inward looking. So we try and do extra efforts to show that we are not doing that, and we are still interested and trying to be active.
Hello, yeah. I was wondering about the thing you spoke about earlier about being respectful, because from my point of view and what my colleague was talking about earlier, like where this is rooted in the British, on the British Islands, like it comes from some kind of, well, my personal opinion is, and I can't speak for everyone else, but that it comes from some kind of hubris that we can do this on our own, we can champion the world, or we can champion growth on our own. And it's hard to stay respectful when someone comes out with a claim like that, like we're a union and we believe that we're going to do this together, and then someone comes out and think they can do it on their own. Like how do you think public opinion is going to look down the road, let's say 10 years, about this whole thing? Like, is this going to strengthen like the position that people think the UK have? Like, are people going to envy them, or are people going to be more, well, disappointed?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really good question. And again, this is kind of my personal take on it. But when you talk about hubris, the David Cameron referendum on EU reminds me a little bit of the Tony Blair war in Iraq. And why I say that is it was both sort of third time unlucky. So Tony Blair's journey was around dossiers of information to promote essentially armed intervention. And the first time was in Sierra Leone, which went extremely well. The second time was in Afghanistan, which did not go so well, but did temporarily defeat the Taliban. And the third time, of course, was Iraq, which has damaged his reputation as a leader of Britain for all time. Same with George Bush. David Cameron's journey of three was referenda. So number one was the UK voting system, which he won extremely easily. Number two was Scottish referendum, which he won close. And number three was the EU, which he lost, but had thought he would win. And so when you talk about hubris, there's perhaps a bit of that, which is, if you try the same trick 2-3 times, maybe it doesn't always work third time lucky. But is there sort of a national British arrogance at play here? Straight answer is, in some parts of the country, yes, there is. But there are also lots of parts of the country that are appalled by that when they hear that too. And I think the country it has a mixed view on how it sees itself in the world. Apart from one thing, which is I think it does agree with itself, that the UK wants to be an international, engaged country and a champion for things of free trade and human rights and military security and poverty reduction and so on. And I don't, some people will come from that saying we're fantastic, we're doing all this stuff. Other people say it's the right thing to do, we should be doing it. So I think maybe what we're doing is consensus, but people have different motivations how they get to it. And how will we be seen in 10 years' time? Well, if you're the European institutions, one of the things they've worried about is, well, they did worry about in 2016, would Brexit lead to Grexit, Dexit, Spanksit, and so on, all others following? I don't think there are many of the 27 watching Britain today saying, that was a great thing to do, we'll just do the same thing, to be honest. Now, maybe in 10 years they will change their minds, but it is, we are, as I said, we are changing 45 years of history and a painful divorce from close partners, and it's quite a painful process. So I don't think many around this certainly is part of Europe are thinking, I'll follow that.
We'll have another seminar in 10 years' time.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We need to move on in the program here, and the next speaker is Professor Charles Woolfson. Charles is Professor Emeritus at the Institute for Research in Migration, Ethnicity and Society, REMESO, here at Linköping University. You took up your share in 2010, I believe, at REMESO, specializing in East-West labor migration. And Professor Woolfson will talk to us about Brexit and migration and free movement of labor. And again, there will be some time for a few questions at the end of after your speech.
Thank you, Per. And I'm very pleased to be here today. I hope the microphone is working. If it's not, Ivan, you'll have to come and help me here.
See if it turned off.
Or the battery's dead. Okay, well, can you hear me? More or less. I am in the happy position this morning. Is it working?
Yeah.
Good. I'm in the happy position of agreeing with more or less everything that the ambassador said. I didn't expect that to be the case. And what I'm going to do today is provide some of the charts and data that actually support the case that the ambassador has just made, which, very briefly, if just to sum up, Brexit was not simply the result of an upsurge of racist, xenophobic emotions in Britain. It had deeper causes that go very much to the financial crisis and what has happened since. And that raises the very interesting question: if we accept the analysis that I'm going to present, will Brexit actually solve the problems that really underlie the vote that took place? So let me begin with migration. You know, looked at comparatively, the UK is not the most anti-migrant country in the EU in terms of the proportion of the population that doesn't want any more migrants to arrive. And I know there are specific reasons why Sweden and Germany rate so highly there, but it's worth bearing that in mind. Now, the ambassador referred to David Cameron and his 3 times, or his third unlucky gamble. The problem for David Cameron was that the United Kingdom Independence Party was winning seats in local elections and in the European Parliament, and was, in a sense, dictating a new agenda inside British politics. And that is why he made the pledge to reduce the number of migrants to tens of thousands, but unfortunately, the very time that he did so, the numbers kept rising. So that context is extremely important. The Labour Party, for its part, tried to debate, rather unsuccessfully, what to do over the rising number of migrants, particularly from the new member states of Eastern Europe since 2004. It's just a quick summary of the press in 2013, with the Labour Party spokesman saying, well, we do rather regret that we signed up for free movement of labour, and moreover, we're particularly worried about unscrupulous British employers who are importing squadrons of workers from Eastern Europe, especially from Poland and the Baltic states. And indeed, the minister, the shadow minister here, was irresponsible enough to refer to Tesco and Next as 2 companies who were especially involved in denying British workers jobs and substituting East European labour. Well, Tesco wasn't very happy about that, and neither was Next, whose chairman shares the same name as me, peculiarly, Lord Woolfson, and he's a Brexit supporter, unbelievably. Anyway, this brings us to Tesco's mysterious case of the shrink-wrapped Lithuanians. Every little helps is Tesco's shopper slogan. And here's a cartoon from The Independent in 2013. Migrant workers, cheap labour, value pack, Tesco, every Lithuanian helps. I think they thought that was clever. Well, the Lithuanians didn't like that, and they produced their own cartoon, British tabloid press. Well, I don't think The Independent's a tabloid. Anyway, Tesco, just take them from us. Well, here's a referendum poster from UKIP. Cheap labour, EU policy at work. British workers are hit hard by unlimited cheap labour. The actor in this poster is actually Irish, but who cares? EU migrants as job thieves. 26 million people are looking for work. Whose job are they after? And then, by the most malign of circumstances, in 2015 and 16, on the very eve of the referendum, the camps started emptying in Syria, and a migrant procession headed towards Europe, which provided the perfect opportunity to fuse British xenophobia in the form of the UKIP party with growing Islamophobia and anti-EU sentiment. The EU has failed us all. We must break free of the EU and take back control of our borders. And there's Nigel Farage, ex-UKIP leader, about to re-emerge on the British political scene. Okay, the ambassador referred to the changes in British society that came with immigration from particularly Eastern Europe. And here's a picture from Boston, which is in the English Fens, a rural agricultural town, very small, which suddenly saw a significant number of East Europeans arriving, and they're European citizens, had every right to be here, and with their own shops and their own, if you like, ways of doing things. Well, the fact was that the farmers in the Fenland imported workers from Eastern Europe because they couldn't get British workers to do the jobs at the rates of pay that they were offering. Didn't stop the British Sun newspaper celebrating the Brexit victory. Streets full of Polish shops, kids not speaking English, but Union Jacks now flying high again. Well, it's heartwarming stuff. People from Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Boston revel in their relief at EU exit. And here's a fine specimen of British manhood on the morning after the referendum result. And a significant spike in hate crimes and anti-immigrant activity in the UK. And indeed, I think, and we can perhaps talk about this, the most worrying thing of all is the rise of the far right in British politics, which we have seen. It's not just populism, it's something far more sinister. So let's just have a quick look at some of the figures. Migrants in the UK population. You can see on this chart the increase in new member states' arrivals from 2004. This is the old EU member states, and it's fairly constant from the beginning of the 2000s. There is a major proportion of the immigration not from the EU, but from third countries, from the rest of the world. And the figures are there in the margin for you. The headline has to be, I think, that the size of the foreign-born population in the UK increased significantly to about 14% of the population, similar figure to Germany and a number of other countries in the EU over a relatively short period. And I think this is the thing which really matters. As the ambassador said, about 1 million of those immigrants were from Poland, followed by Romania. But look, number 3 on the chart is India, and followed by the Republic of Ireland, which is in a common travel area with Britain. The rest, well, there's Lithuania, where I lived for 10 years, still significant number of migrants in terms of the total. Well, for Theresa May, it was very clear that Brexit was about immigration and the need to, as it were, control the freedom of movement from the European Union, and to bring it down, as she said, to, quote, sustainable levels. And by that she meant tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. It's an open question as to whether that's ever going to be attainable, but certainly, as we'll see in a moment, freedom of movement as we have known it is likely to come to an end very soon. But migration, again, as the ambassador correctly pointed out, is important, but not the whole story. Look at this map of Britain, which shows the areas that voted leave. They're really most of England, apart from London and the richer university towns, voted overwhelmingly to leave. Scotland did not, and Northern Ireland also for specific reasons didn't. But if you look at the Yorkshire area, the West and East Midlands, I mean, this is 60% of the population. All these people that keep saying it was a narrow vote, well, it wasn't, you know. It depends how you look at it. The key factors, in my view, and this really is a stark chart, have to do with the economics that followed the global financial crisis. London has always been significantly better off than the rest of the UK. But if you compare how London has done with GDP, gross domestic product, with the rest of the UK, the disparity is really significant. In fact, wages are substantially below what they were at the time of the financial crisis. They have not yet recovered. So there are large areas of Britain that remain in relative poverty at this time. And indeed, it's a generational thing. Those in the cohort of 30 to 39 have suffered the most significant fall in earnings. And these are the very people that would want to settle down, establish a family, get a mortgage, and all the rest of it. So effectively, earnings are down significantly since the financial crisis. And here we can see by how much right the way across the UK, but especially in areas like the Midlands, Cornwall, and so on, the Northwest. And the jobs that have been created since the financial crisis are temporary, poorly paid, precarious labour, the so-called gig economy. And the latest figures suggest there's something like, I think it's 1.25 million workers in the gig economy, this new so-called platform economy with no proper contracts of employment, no proper employment conditions or rights. And the growth of 0 hours contracts, especially since the financial crisis, 2008 to the present day. Yeah, I mean, Labour Party, I'm not going to be partisan here, but the Labour Party has said they will outlaw 0 hours contracts. And of course, any reputable institution would have nothing to do with imposing such forms. So to sum up, Brexit's other drivers are regional inequalities and deindustrialization, depression of wages, especially since the 2008 crisis, austerity policies which have cut public services, housing, welfare, and produced essentially a poorer standard of living across the entire UK. 400,000 civil servants lost their jobs during austerity, which is ongoing. And the reduction of good jobs, replacement by precarious jobs, and I think somewhat neglected important factor, the squeezing of the middle income sectors of society. It's not just those in the working classes and at the lower ends of the socio-economic ladder. It's also those in the middle who cannot get the kind of jobs that they had hoped to get and that their parents expected them to get. So, moving on now to the question of what are the future prospects for free movement of labour. First of all, I want to say there has been a Brexit effect. Those EU citizens who were here, less of them are coming, and net migration has reduced significantly to 64,000 in the latest figures that I could get. So we have something of a Brexodus, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. More interesting is the fact that non-EU third country migration is also rising at this time. So clearly there are questions of labour shortages and where employers are going to find the kinds of labour that they needed to perform the jobs at the rates they were prepared to pay. Well, here's the employment of EU nationals, that's old and new member states in the UK. It's about 9% of the workforce. Nearly 1 in 5 establishments employs an EU worker. Hotels, restaurants, health and social work, manufacturing, IT, and so on and so forth. There are some handouts which people can pick up as they go, and you can study the charts in more detail perhaps at your leisure, because I don't have a lot of time to talk in detail just now. The proportion of employers who are looking to the EU to fill positions which are difficult to fill at this time, in hotels and restaurants, 53%, manufacturing, 41%, transport and storage. So look, there is no question that Britain is going to be facing a significant problem in recruiting the kind of labour that it needs to be a fully functioning economy. And that, I'm afraid, is not going to be assisted by current political developments and proposals. The post-Brexit migration regime, well, in Theresa May's famous words, EU nationals won't be able to jump the queue ahead of engineers from Sydney or software developers from Delhi. Well, good luck with that, Theresa, because I don't think they're queuing up. So instead of a system based on where a person is from, we're going to have a skills-based system. That remains to be seen, actually, and how you implement such a complex system will be something that I'll be watching very closely. At this time, of course, we don't know the results. So let me, as I'm coming to the last slides here, talk about the issue that I do not think is going to be solved by Brexit and by ending free movement, and that is labour productivity. The UK has got a long-lasting labour productivity problem. In fact, our performance is, well, bloody poor, actually, and well below, in terms of output per worker, the average for the G7 industrial nations. And indeed, and this is interesting, following the crisis of of 2008, UK companies have moved to hire extensively from the poorer Eastern EU countries. This has created an investment-weak recovery since the crisis, and the kind of evidence, isn't time to show you in detail, if you look at the UK employment of robotics, for example, in industry, it's pathetically low. It's the lowest in the advanced industrial nations league. And this productivity chart shows us very nicely that output per hour, had it continued at pre-crisis levels, would be 20% more than it is today. In fact, productivity is flatlining in the UK, and the truth of the matter is that it seems that employers are more willing to use low-cost, cheap labour than invest in the kind of advanced technologies that Britain needs. So I see the ending of free movement as both an opportunity and perhaps not so much a threat if, and it's a big if, it incentivizes employers to move away from cheap, low-skilled labour and invest in new technologies, and compels the UK government to embark on comprehensive skills training. And finally, where it introduces a sensible, regulated supply of labour that works under decent terms and conditions, and stops, and we never talk about this really, but stops the draining of human resources from the peripheral East European countries. I lived in Lithuania, as I said. I lived through the crash there. I lived through the aftermath. And I watched, that is a nation that is actually now demographically unsustainable due to migration. It's about 20% of the population has gone. I mean, it's extraordinary. The streets are empty in Vilnius. Anyway, I haven't got time to talk about that. Is there a wider positive to Brexit? My last comments. Well, frankly, many see the EU as undemocratic and politically remote. I think the ambassador alluded to that. And I think there is an argument that the EU is hostile to the interests of working people, to migrants, to the poor, and that much of the ideology of social progress, the European social model, a social Europe, I think is looking increasingly threadbare. I just say one word, Greece, and move on quietly. The second thing to say is that nation states are still the key arena where people feel they can exercise democratic control over public policy, even in the age of globalization. Deny them that, and you get the kind of populism that we're seeing. A sovereign UK, popular, national, democratic project could be a break with austerity policies and could rebuild Britain's ailing industrial infrastructure. My last slide. If all else fails, you can buy a Brexit box. Now you have three options. I'm a little concerned, I'm pretty worried, or I'm properly panicking. Just select your level of Brexit angst and we'll recommend the right stockpiling for you and your loved ones. You'll have the last laugh, you'll survive 3 months, and with this, it should see you through the first few months of chaos and civil unrest. It includes absinthe, which I understand used to be a hallucinogenic drink. So with your Brexit box, which by the way will cost you over £1,000, you get 96 cans of sardines, 120 of tuna, 60 of baked beans, and I see in the Mail on Sunday that among Jeremy Corbyn's many crimes against humanity is the fact that he doesn't know how to distinguish Asda baked beans from Heinz baked beans. Well, maybe now he'll get the opportunity. So that's it, and thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. If I may just make sort of a comment, not as much as a question, coming back to one of your very last slides here. I don't want to raise it since it is sort of a favorite theme of mine anyway, but you said that the nation states are still the key arena where democratic control and policy options can be exercised by the peoples. And I mean, the comment is really that, one is of course that I suppose this is the positive side of or the other side of the kind of right-wing nationalistic rage that we see in Europe, and the positive side of this is sort of a realization that yes, nation states matter, and in particular as sort of the platform where people actually identify for political purposes, where legitimacy and these kinds of things becomes important, and I think that's part of a wider story that to the effect that. Even though we speak so much about globalizations and international institutions and all these important things, nation states still do matter. I think that's one of many important observations that one can make out of your speech. Okay, we are pretty much on schedule, I think, so we do have time for a few questions. Let's see if we can, where is the microphone? Okay. There were two people up on this side, I think, first. I'm not. There cannot be perfect justice in this, but.
Maybe Per, I could just comment on
Yes,
your comment. It's not just the right that believes in the importance of sovereignty and political self-determination. This has long been a view from the left as well. A progressive, inclusive nationalism counterposed to a reactionary, exclusionary nationalism. And that kind of inclusive and progressive nationalism has a long historical pedigree. And even going back to the 1960s in the national liberation struggles in the continent of Africa, they were led by nationalists who were at the same time progressive in character. So there is a kind of horror when anybody says the word nation or nationalism. I think we need a more subtle and nuanced view of this topic. I'll leave it there.
Okay, please.
Okay. I think this last topic of nationalism is probably more complicated than this. And to oppose it to EU is probably needs more talking. Where is the place of it? I wanted to put the question earlier. I want only to say that I profoundly disagree with the idea that the brain drain has to be solved by not letting people in. Brain drain has to be solved by not letting the people want to go out. So it's not the fault of the countries who take in. It's the situation in the countries where they are coming from. It's a very hypocritical way to say we don't let them in because they should stay and contribute them. Okay, but not that is my question. All these reasons, which also His Excellency Ambassador and you brought up, starting with the economic crisis, with immigration from inside EU and outside EU and so on, mutatis mutandis, they are the same in all Western Europe. Very few of those issues are specific to the UK. And they are the same in the big Western European countries and in the small. Nevertheless, and this has raised this kind of extremist populist parties, both in the rest of in EU, in the EU and in UK.
Okay, sir, do you have a question?
Yes, yes. The question comes. The question comes. However, in the rest of Europe, the main political parties have tried to isolate this. It's the UK where the main political parties have contributed to this Brexit. So what I want to say, the reasons which were brought up, crisis and immigration, explain why the Brexit referendum went through. Even that is not explained, like our colleague said, because the question was not put in the right way. But anyway, it explains why so many people have voted. But it doesn't explain why the main UK parties have embraced this. More or less both, as opposed to all the rest of Europe, where this populist propaganda has not been embraced by the mainstream parties.
I'm not sure what the question.
So the question is, what is specific for the UK as opposed to Germany that they want to get out? In fact, the reasons which you brought up are the same.
Okay. So you've asked a very good question. Let me just say that the shift to the right to embrace populist ideas is not an exclusively UK phenomenon. And if you look at some of the parties in government in Europe today, they are populist right-wing parties. The fact is, what we're talking about here is a failure of social democracy, a failure of the left to properly combat the ideas of racism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment. It was Edward Miliband who produced a campaign mug for the 2015 election which promised to control immigration. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. That was the British Labour Party, and that was their policy. And indeed, and I don't want to be critical of my hosts here in Sweden, but I see similar pressures in social democracy here in Sweden. And the fact of the matter is that the left has failed to address issues of identity, of sovereignty, and of inequality in a way that actually makes sense to the people that experience these problems. That's a huge political failure, and it's a failure across the Western social democracies. And that's why we are in the world that we are in today. And when I referred to darker forces, this failure of the left has vacated the ground to allow the neo-fascist right to start making the political arguments. Look at Germany today, AfD, 94 MPs. The ambassador wanted to say something.
Yeah, sure. Just to say, a very, very good question. I didn't go on this very much detail, but I think you would also want to look at kind of the history of the UK's relationships with the EU, especially from Margaret Thatcher's time and the Treaty of Maastricht, where in a very incremental basis, this idea that Europe was a problem, not a solution, has grown and grown over time. You also had in the 2000s the idea of a European convention and a European-wide vote on the future of Europe, which never happened, which also led to a story about being people's rights and demos being taken away. And that grew and led to promises in our own politics of, well, we will give you that voice, we'll give you that vote if the treaty's changed, and then eventually we'll give you that vote on and off. And that was something that wasn't foreseen back in 1992, but grew over 25 years, I would say.
Okay, I think we will have to actually put an end to things right now. I'll say Ambassador Cairns, Professor Woolfson, thank you very much for your speeches and your contributions, and the rest of you for your questions and your interest.
We've made up our minds. We're going to do new. Do something else. Do more. Do the impossible. Do better. Do good. Do big. Do small. Do it wrong. Do it again. Do it ourselves. Do it together. Do what no one else has done. Do what will become big. Do the same. Do different. Do everything. Do something. Do new.